The servers didn't catch fire. They just hummed a low, indifferent vibration beneath my cheap sneakers as $90 million evaporated in 3 seconds. I watched the live feed on my phone from the parking lot across the street. In exactly 4 minutes, the CEO who stole my life's work would realize his new flagship app was eating its own database. Last time, I begged him not to take it. This time, I handed him the match. Death didn't come with a white light or a grand life review. It came with the overwhelming smell of ammonia and the sensation of wet concrete against my cheek. My heart had simply given out in the parking garage of a cheap apartment complex I couldn't afford anymore. 3 years of grinding poverty, legal fees, and the quiet, crushing humiliation of watching another man get rich off my sweat had physically eroded the muscle in my chest. I remember a sharp tearing pain down my left arm. I remember the taste of copper, then just a heavy, suffocating dark. So when my eyes snapped open, the first thing I did wasn't gasp in awe. I choked on a mouthful of lukewarm, stale coffee. I bolted upright, my chair squeaking violently against a plastic floor mat. I was gasping, clawing at my chest, expecting the tearing pain, the fatal numbness. Nothing. Just the frantic, healthy thud of a 30-year-old heart against my ribs. My vision swam, adjusting to the aggressive glare of fluorescent overhead lights. They had a distinct, high-pitched buzz, a sound I hadn't heard in 3 years. The smell hit me next. Ozone-scorched dust from overworked CPU fans and the faint chemical scent of cheap carpet cleaner. I was sitting at a desk, my old desk. I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, but they weren't the pale, thinning hands of a man who had spent the last 2 years eating instant ramen and dodging collection calls. They were solid. Under my right palm was a sticky, basic issue Dell keyboard. I glanced at the bottom right corner of the monitor. October 12th. It was exactly 3 days before the quarterly review. 3 days before the day my life ended the first time. A wave of intense nausea hit me. I pushed back from the desk, stumbling over the wheels of my chair, and barely made it to the small office kitchenette before throwing up into the aluminum sink. I gripped the edges of the counter, the cold metal biting into my palms, and stared at my reflection in the dark, smudged window pane above the coffee maker. I looked exhausted. Sure, deep purple bags hung under my eyes. But I was alive, and I was back. "Rough night, Nate?" The voice was smooth, pitched in that practiced conversational tone that always sounded like a focus group had approved it. I froze. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. The scent of sandalwood and expensive dry cleaning preceded him. Simon. He leaned against the doorframe of the kitchenette, holding a sleek ceramic travel mug. He wore a crisp, light blue button-down, rolled up to the forearms, just enough to show off a watch that cost more than my car. He looked exactly the way he did on the Forbes 30 Under 30, cover 2 years from now. In my previous life, seeing him like this would have triggered a pathetic scramble to look busy, to prove my worth. Later, after he stole my work, seeing his face on billboards made me want to put my fist through drywall. Now, looking at him, standing there, feigning casual concern, while actively plotting to strip mine my brain, I didn't feel rage. I felt a profound, heavy exhaustion. "Just a bug," I croaked, wiping my mouth with the back of my hand. My voice sounded thin, alien to my own ears. Something in the code was giving me a headache. Simon chuckled, taking a slow sip from his mug. "You need to learn how to delegate, man. You're always down in the weeds. The big picture is where the value is. Speaking of how's the compression algorithm coming for the Vault project, Greg wants a status update by tomorrow morning. The Vault project. It was an enterprise-level data aggregation and compression tool. I had built it from scratch, staying in this miserable cubicle until 3 a.m. for 8 months straight. I built it because I believed in it. It was revolutionary. It could have server costs for massive data farms without losing a single packet of integrity. In the original timeline, I told Simon it was finished. I showed him the raw files. 2 days later, he pitched it to the board as his own architectural design, claiming I was just a code monkey who typed out his vision. Because the repository was on company servers, and because Simon was a senior director while I was a mid-level engineer, the board believed him. They gave him a promotion, a new division, and a multi-million-dollar equity grant. I threw a chair across the boardroom, called him a thief, and was escorted out by security. Blacklisted. Ruined. I rinsed the sink, watching the water swirl down the drain. My mind was moving too fast, clicking through the traumatic memories of my first life, contrasting them with the sterile reality of the present. I could fight him right now. I could email the source code to myself, establish a paper trail, go to HR, lock him out of the repository. But as I looked at Simon's smug, relaxed posture, a cold, hard realization settled in my gut, like swallowed lead. If I fought him now, it would be a messy corporate dispute. I might keep my job. I might even get a small bonus. But Simon would survive. He would pivot, charm the executives, and find another way to climb over my back. The system was designed for people like him to win. I didn't want to win a corporate dispute. I wanted him to burn. It's getting there, I said, forcing a weary sigh. I walked past him, making sure to avoid eye contact, so he wouldn't see the sudden lack of fear in my eyes. I'm hitting a wall with the memory allocation. Might need to take the drive home tonight and look at it with fresh eyes. Simon's posture shifted. It was microscopic, a slight tightening of his jaw, a brief stillness in his breathing. He was predatory, and I had just offered him the scent of blood. "Don't burn yourself out, Nate," he said smoothly. "If you want, leave the flash drive on my desk before you head out. I can take a look, maybe find the bottleneck for you." "Nah," I said, rubbing the back of my neck, playing the protective, stubborn coder perfectly. "I'll figure it out. It just needs a little tweaking." I walked back to my cubicle and slumped into the chair. My hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from the shock of time travel. It was adrenaline, a dark, terrifying kind of thrill. He was going to steal it. I knew exactly how, and I knew exactly when. All I had to do was make sure the thing he stole was a bomb. Writing code that works is difficult. Writing code that fails invisibly, catastrophically, imperfectly on schedule is an entirely different discipline. For the next 2 days, I lived in a state of suspended animation. I drank awful office coffee that tasted like burnt plastic and copper. I ate vending machine crackers that left a film of synthetic salt on the roof of my mouth. I wore the same gray hoodie, letting the cuffs get stained with ink and grease. I needed to look exactly like the desperate, overworked engineer Simon expected me to be. The office around me moved in a predictable, mundane rhythm. The sales team on the 3rd floor rang a small brass bell every time they closed a deal. Greg, our middle manager, paced the aisles at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., loudly asking people about their synergy and bandwidth. It felt like walking through a museum exhibit of my own past. Nothing was real, except the glowing lines of text on my dual monitors. I had to be careful. The Vault app was beautiful in its original form. It used a dynamic sorting algorithm that recognized redundant data patterns and collapsed them. It was elegant. To ruin it, I couldn't just insert a virus or a sloppy bug. Simon wasn't a great coder, but he wasn't completely illiterate. He would run it through standard diagnostic tools before pitching it as his own. If the compiler threw an error, or if the memory spiked during a basic stress test, he would know something was wrong. The trap had to be systemic. It had to be a logic bomb. I started stripping out the safety limiters in the core garbage collection routines. I wrote a seemingly benign background process that I labeled data_index_verification. To any automated scanner, it looked like a standard background check, ensuring data integrity. In reality, it was a cancer. I rigged the logic so that the process remained completely dormant until the system hit a specific threshold, 50,000 concurrent active users. Until it hit that exact number, the app would run flawlessly, better than flawlessly. It would be blindingly fast, proving its worth, securing the venture capital, locking Simon into ironclad contracts with enterprise clients. But the millisecond the 50,000th user logged in the data_index_verification process would wake up, it would begin to silently duplicate the redundant data. Instead of deleting it, it wouldn't crash the system immediately. It would create a cascading memory leak. For every megabyte of data processed, it would quietly cache 2, then 4, then 8. Because it was enterprise data, financial records, healthcare logs, logistics, tracking the server costs to process this geometric explosion of ghost data would skyrocket. The cloud providers would automatically scale the servers to handle the load, billing the company by the minute. By the time the alarms went off, the app would be consuming hundreds of thousands of dollars in server fees per hour. And the best part, when they eventually tried to shut the servers down to stop the financial bleeding, the sudden termination of the replication loops would permanently corrupt the master database. It was corporate suicide wrapped in a bow. My fingers cramped as I typed. I kept glancing over the low wall of my cubicle. Every time Simon walked past, I minimized the window, pulling up a fake, broken string of code I had prepared just for him to see. Still banging your head against the wall?" Simon asked on Thursday afternoon. He leaned over my partition, invading my space. He smelled strongly of peppermint gum today. "Yeah," I lied, running a hand over my face, letting my voice crack slightly. "The memory allocation is a mess. I've got it working locally, but if I push it to a live environment, it might destabilize. Maybe you should let me loop in some of the senior guys," Simon suggested. The condescension in his tone was thick, oily. "You've done good grunt work, Nate, but architectural deployment requires a different skill set." "No," I snapped. I needed to act territorial. I needed him to think I was fiercely protecting my baby. "No, I'm close. Just give me tonight. I'll compile the master build onto my external drive, run it on the sandbox server at home, and bring it in tomorrow. It'll be ready for the pitch." Simon stared at me for a long moment. His eyes were cold, assessing. He was calculating the risk. If I brought it in tomorrow and pitched it to Greg myself, Simon wouldn't have time to understand the architecture. He wouldn't be able to steal the credit. He needed the code tonight. "All right, Nate," he said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "It's your funeral if it fails. Don't stay too late." He walked away. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had given him the timetable. I had given him the location. The master build would be on my external drive. Tonight, I spent the next 4 hours finishing the rig. Every line of code I wrote felt heavy, fraught with a strange, sickening guilt. Not for Simon. I didn't give a damn about him. But my code had always been my pride. Purposefully breaking it, engineering it to cause millions of dollars in damages, felt like snapping the neck of a bird I had nursed back to health. I had to remind myself of the freezing apartment, the collection calls, the chest pain. At 7 p.m., the office began to empty out. By 8:30 p.m., it was just the humming fluorescent lights, the distant hum of the HVAC system, and me. I compiled the code. I ran it locally. It was perfect, smooth, sleek, and utterly lethal. I plugged in my heavy brushed aluminum external hard drive, the one I kept on my desk, like a paperweight. I copied the repository over. I named the folder vault_master_v1_do_not_share. Then I stood up, stretched my aching back, and left the drive, sitting right next to my keyboard. I didn't stay in the office. In the original timeline, I had fallen asleep at my desk, exhausted, only to wake up the next morning to find my drive wiped and Simon already in Greg's office. This time, I needed to give him a wide, clear path. I grabbed my jacket and walked out of the building. The night air was sharp and damp. It had started to drizzle, that miserable fine mist that doesn't wash anything clean, but just makes the oil slicks on the asphalt look like bruised rainbows. I walked 2 blocks to a 24-hour diner called the Brass Lantern. It was the kind of place that smelled permanently of old frying grease, bleach, and damp wool. I slid into a vinyl booth near the back. The vinyl was cracked, covered in strips of clear packing tape that scratched the back of my legs. "Coffee?" the waitress asked. She looked tired, wearing a faded pink apron, holding a glass pot of black sludge. "Please," I said. "And whatever the cheapest fries you have are." She poured the coffee. It tasted exactly how it looked, bitter, burnt, and metallic. I stared out the rain-streaked window, watching the traffic lights change from red to green to yellow, illuminating the empty street. It was 9:15 p.m. Simon had keycard access to the entire building. I knew his routine. He usually went to a high-end gym 3 blocks from the office, worked out, took a steam, and then drove home. But tonight, he wouldn't drive home. He would wait until the cleaning crew finished the second floor at 9 p.m. Then he would swipe back in. I sat in the diner, imagining the sequence of events. The thought made my stomach churn, a toxic mix of anxiety and vindication. I pictured Simon walking onto the empty floor, the soles of his expensive leather shoes squeaking faintly on the linoleum. I imagined him looking over the low wall of my cubicle, seeing the empty chair, the locked computer monitor. And there, sitting in the glow of the standby, light the brushed aluminum hard drive. My chest tightened. What if he didn't take it? What if the timeline had shifted just enough that he decided it was too risky? What if my territorial act earlier had scared him off instead of provoking him? If he didn't take it, I was stuck. I would have to pitch a rigged application myself, which would ruin me. I chewed on a limp, lukewarm fry, the starch turning to paste in my mouth. I checked my phone. 9:45 p.m. I couldn't take the waiting anymore. I dropped a $5 bill on the sticky table and hurried out into the drizzle. The cold air felt good on my hot face. I practically jogged the 2 blocks back to the office building. Dave, The night security guard was sitting at the front desk, watching a baseball game on a small portable TV. "Forgot something, Nate?" Dave asked, barely looking up from a pitch. "Yeah." I forced a laugh, my voice tight. "Left my keys on my desk. I'd lose my head if it wasn't attached." "Happens," Dave grunted. I swiped my badge and took the elevator up to the second floor. The doors slid open with a soft, hydraulic hiss. The floor was dark, illuminated only by the emergency exit signs and the security lighting. The silence was absolute, heavy, and ringing in my ears. I walked down the main aisle, my heartbeat thudding against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack them. I turned the corner into my row of cubicles. I stood in front of my desk. I didn't turn on the overhead light. I just stared at the desk surface. I am a creature of extreme habit. Years of anxiety and coding had made me meticulous about my physical workspace. I always placed my external hard drive exactly parallel to the edge of my monitor stand. It was a stupid small comfort, but it was mine. I leaned in, squinting in the dim light. The hard drive was still there. For a second, the bottom dropped out of my stomach. He hadn't taken it. I had failed. The timeline was broken. But then I looked closer. The drive was angled. It was shifted perhaps half an inch to the left, no longer perfectly parallel to the monitor base. And beneath it, peeking out from the shadow of the aluminum casing, was a tiny, microscopic scratch on the laminate desk surface, fresh and pale. Simon was left-handed. He had picked it up, copied the files to his own encrypted flash drive, using his laptop, and hastily put it back down, favoring his dominant hand. I stood there in the dark, the faint hum of the servers echoing through the floorboards. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply. Beneath the smell of ozone and carpet cleaner, there was a faint, almost imperceptible lingering scent in the air of my cubicle. Sandalwood and peppermint. A slow, involuntary shudder racked my body. It wasn't a heroic feeling. It didn't feel like triumph or justice. It felt incredibly ugly. It felt like I had just willingly stepped off a ledge into an abyss, and there was absolutely no climbing back up. I reached out my fingers, brushing the cold metal of the hard drive. He had it. The bomb was in his pocket, and tomorrow morning he was going to walk into the boardroom and tie it around his own neck. The email hit my inbox at 8:15 a.m. on Friday. Mandatory division stand-up. 9 a.m. Conference room, B. I stared at the stark black text on my monitor. My stomach executed a slow, sickening roll, the kind you get when you step off a curb you didn't know was there. I had engineered this moment. I had stayed up for days, building the snare, baited it, and watched Simon drag it back to his lair. But knowing the punch is coming doesn't stop it from rattling your jaw. At 8:55 a.m., I walked into conference room B. It was a sterile, glass-walled box that always smelled faintly of dry erase markers and ozone from the overhead projector. The AC was cranked too high, raising goosebumps on my forearms. Greg, the division VP, was already there. He was a thick-necked man who wore suits a half size too small, currently leaning back in a leather chair that groaned under his weight. And there was Simon. He was standing near the projector, looking rested and radiant. He wore a tailored navy blazer today. When he saw me walk, in his eyes flicked toward me just a microsecond of assessment before his lips curved into a relaxed, rehearsed smile. "Take a seat, everyone," Greg boomed, tapping a heavy gold pen against the frosted glass of the table. "Simon has something to show us, something that's going to make the Q4 earnings report look very, very pretty." I pulled out a chair near the back. The fake leather was cold against my thighs. I gripped the edge of the table, focusing on the rough texture of the veneer beneath my fingernails, to keep my hands from shaking. Simon dimmed the lights. The projector hummed to life, throwing a sharp, blue-tinted rectangle against the far wall. Team. Simon began his voice, dropping into that smooth, authoritative register he saved for executives. For the past 6 months, we've been struggling with the server overhead on our enterprise data hubs. It's our biggest bottleneck. But over the last few weeks, working nights and weekends, I think I've cracked it. He clicked his remote. A slide appeared. It read, Project Aegis, Dynamic Redundancy Elimination. He hadn't even kept my name for it. He changed Vault to Aegis. Simon clicked to the next slide, bringing up a live demonstration environment. He booted the compiler. My breath caught in my throat. I watched the lines of code scroll rapidly down the screen. I knew every indent, every variable name, every semicolon. I had typed them in a freezing apartment while eating generic brand cereal. I had rewritten the garbage collection routine 4 times. It was my baby, and it was wearing a stolen name tag. By creating a dynamic sorting algorithm, Simon lied. Fluidly making eye contact with Greg, I found a way to identify redundant data patterns and collapse them before they hit the storage arrays. Aegis doesn't just compress data, it cures the bloat. He ran the stress test. The numbers on the screen flashed green. Memory usage plummeted by 40%. Processing speed doubled. The room let out a collective, low murmur of approval. Incredible, Greg muttered, sitting forward, his small eyes widening greedily. Simon, this is proprietary. You built it from the ground up, Simon said, modestly, placing a hand over his heart. It took a lot of trial and error, but I knew we needed a systemic solution, not just a Band-Aid. It was time. I didn't have to fake the physical reaction. The sheer audacity of his lie, the casual way he erased my existence, brought a genuine stinging heat to my eyes. My chest tightened. I stood up. My chair scraped violently against the carpet. That's mine, I said. The room went dead silent. The projector fan sounded like a jet engine in the quiet. Greg frowned, turning to look at me as if he'd forgotten I was in the room. Excuse me, Nate. That code, I said, my voice cracking perfectly. I pointed a trembling finger at the screen. That is the Vault project. I've been working on it for 8 months. I told you about it on Wednesday, Simon. I told you I was running it locally. Simon didn't flinch. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and mild annoyance. It was an Oscar-worthy performance. Nate, Simon said, softly, adopting the tone of a disappointed father. I know you've been struggling with your memory allocation tasks. I know you're stressed, but this is Aegis. I've been logging the architecture on my personal drive for a month. You stole my external drive last night, I shouted, letting the panic bleed into my voice. I took a step toward him. You copied the repository. Greg stood up, his face darkening. Sit down, Nate. Right now. Check the metadata, I pleaded, turning to Greg, putting my hands on the table. Look at the compile timestamps. Look at the variable names. It's my code. I did check the metadata this morning. Actually, Greg said coldly, Simon sent me the repository at 6 a.m. It's clean. And frankly, Nate, given your performance reviews lately, I find it hard to believe you engineered an enterprise-level dynamic algorithm. They had already decided. Of course they had. Simon was the golden boy. I was just the gristle in the machine. You're lying, I whispered, staring at Simon. Simon sighed. Greg, I think Nate needs some time off. He's clearly overworked. He's projecting. I think he needs more than time off. Greg snapped. He picked up his desk phone. Security to conference room B, please. I didn't fight when the 2 guards arrived. I didn't scream or throw a chair like I did in my first life. I just let my shoulders slump my head, hanging low, staring at the gray carpet pattern as they escorted me out. I let them pack my desk into a single, pathetic cardboard box. I walked out the automatic glass doors into the parking lot. The sun was blindingly bright. I carried my box to my rusted sedan, unlocked the door, and tossed it into the passenger seat. I sat behind the steering wheel, gripping the cracked leather cover. I breathed in the smell of stale air freshener and hot dust, and then alone in the silence of my car, I smiled. It was a terrible, jagged thing, tearing at my cheeks. They took it. The hook was set deep in the meat of their throats, and they were already swimming away, completely unaware of the line trailing behind them. The next 2 months were an exercise in psychological torture. Revenge, I learned, is not a cinematic montage of training and triumphant smirks. Revenge is waiting in line at a discount grocery store, counting nickels to afford generic peanut butter, while the man you intend to ruin gives a keynote speech on YouTube. I had moved out of my apartment and rented a damp single-room studio above a laundromat in the industrial district. It was all I could afford with my meager savings. The constant rhythmic thumping of the commercial washing machines beneath my floorboards became the soundtrack to my exile. The room smelled of bleach, wet lint, and old brick. My daily routine was monastic. I woke up. I drank cheap instant coffee that tasted like burnt soil. I opened my laptop, its fan, whining in protest, and I watched them win. Axiom Software. My former employer was on a meteoric rise. Simon's pitch had worked flawlessly. Aegis was deployed to a select handful of their biggest beta clients. Because the threshold logic bomb required 50,000 active concurrent users to wake up, the software behaved perfectly in the limited beta environments. It did exactly what I designed the benign half of the code. To do, it crushed data bloat, slashed server latency, and made Axiom look like the savior of the cloud computing world. I sat on a thrift store couch that smelled faintly of dog hair, staring at the harsh glare of my screen, reading the headlines. Axiom secures $50 million, Series B funding on back of revolutionary Aegis tech. Simon Vance named top 40, under 40 innovators in enterprise architecture. I watched a video podcast where Simon sat in a minimalist studio wearing a black turtleneck, casually explaining his inspiration for the dynamic sorting algorithm. He used my exact phrasing. He talked about collapsing redundant data patterns with the confident ease of a man who actually understood the math beneath it. Watching someone wear your skin is a uniquely nauseating experience. My hands would shake so badly, I had to close the laptop. I would pace the length of my tiny studio, the floorboards groaning, feeling the phantom limbs of my stolen career twitching in the void. There were nights when the cold of the unheated room seeped into my bones, and the isolation felt suffocating. In those dark, quiet hours, doubt would creep in like black mold. What if I miscalculated? What if Simon brings in a genius consultant who audits the code and spots the dormant data underscore index underscore verification process? What if they patch it before it hits the threshold? Worse than the doubt was the guilt. I wasn't just going to ruin Simon. Axiom employed 200 people. The receptionist, who always smiled at me, the junior devs trying to pay off their student loans, the janitorial staff. When the servers melted down and the company faced breach of contract lawsuits from every major client, Axiom wouldn't just fire Simon. They would go bankrupt. I was building a pyre, and innocent people were going to burn on it just because they stood too close to the man I hated. One Tuesday night in late November, the rain was lashing against my single, grimy window. I had a bottle of cheap whiskey, open on the rickety desk. I stared at my phone. I knew Greg's direct extension. I could call him anonymously. I could tell him exactly which lines of code to delete to defuse the bomb. I could save the company, save the jobs, and just walk away. Let Simon have the glory. Find a new career. Be a better person. I reached for the phone, my fingers brushing the cold glass screen. As I did, a sharp, phantom pain lanced down my left arm. It wasn't a heart attack. My new young heart was beating fine. But it was a somatic memory, violently irreal. I tasted copper on the back of my tongue. I smelled the wet concrete of the parking garage, where I had died in my previous life. I remembered the 3 years of legal battles, the way Simon's lawyers had systematically drained my bank accounts, mocked my evidence, and humiliated me in depositions. I remembered the eviction notices, the way my chest had felt like it was filling with crushed glass right before the lights went out. I pulled my hand back from the phone. I poured myself 2 fingers of the harsh whiskey and drank it neat, letting the alcohol burn the copper taste out of my mouth. I didn't call. I wasn't a hero. I was a casualty of a brutal system, and I had simply learned how to use their own gravity against them. I wrapped myself in a thin fleece blanket, lay on the sagging mattress, and listened to the washing machines thump downstairs, waiting for the trap to spring. December 14th, launch day. Axiom was pushing Aegis out of beta and deploying it live to their entire enterprise client list. Healthcare networks, logistics providers, regional financial hubs. All of them were being forcibly migrated to the new, hyper-efficient architecture. I had been awake for 36 hours. My eyes felt like they were packed with hot sand. The skin around my fingernails was chewed raw and bleeding. I sat at my desk in the dim studio. The only light came from the dual monitors I had salvaged from a pawn shop. On the left screen, I had Axiom's public-facing API status page open. It didn't show proprietary data, but it showed server response times, active connection nodes, and total data throughput. On the right screen, I had a simple, looping ping script I had written. It was knocking on Axiom's main data ingress port every 5 seconds, measuring latency. Right now, it was a flat, healthy green line, 12 milliseconds, blindingly fast. Axiom had put out a press release at 8 a.m. boasting about the seamless migration. Simon had tweeted a picture of himself holding a glass of champagne in the boardroom. 10 a.m. 15,000 active concurrent users. The servers hummed along. The latency stayed at 12 milliseconds. 12:30 p.m. 28,000 active concurrent users. I ate a piece of stale bread, my stomach churning acid. The thumping of the laundromat downstairs seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. 3 p.m. 41,000 active concurrent users. The West Coast offices were clocking in. Logistics hubs were syncing their daily manifests. Hospitals were updating patient records. The data flow was turning from a stream into a raging river. I leaned closer to the monitor. The glare dug into my retinas. 4:45 p.m. 48,500. 49,100, 49,700. My breath hitched. I stopped, chewing the skin on my thumb. The room around me seemed to compress the air, growing thick and heavy. 49,950. I placed my hand flat on the desk, feeling the cheap particle board grain. I was looking for an anchor, something real in a moment that felt entirely surreal. 49,998. 49,999. 50,000. It happened in absolute silence. There were no klaxons, no flashing red lights on my screen. The API dashboard didn't suddenly crash. For 30 excruciating seconds, nothing happened at all. I stared at the ping script on my right monitor. 12 milliseconds, 12 milliseconds, 12 milliseconds. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead. Had I failed? Had the compiler stripped out my dormant process? Had someone at Axiom caught the logic loop in the final code review? The panic was a physical weight pressing down on my chest. I grabbed the edges of the monitor, my knuckles turning white. Then the script refreshed. 14 milliseconds. I froze. 17 milliseconds. It was a tiny fluctuation. Normal network traffic could cause it. 24 milliseconds. My heart hammered against my ribs. 45 milliseconds. Deep inside, Axiom's pristine million-dollar server farms, the data_index_verification process had opened its eyes. It looked at the massive, swirling ocean of incoming data, and instead of sorting it, it began to meticulously, aggressively copy it. Every single packet of data that hit the server was duplicated in a hidden cache. Then the cache was duplicated. Then the duplicate of the cache was duplicated. 89 milliseconds, 150 milliseconds, 340 milliseconds. The latency line on my graph, which had been flat all day, suddenly hooked upward into a vicious, steep parabola. I switched my gaze to the API status page. The total data throughput metric was climbing, not linearly, exponentially. It jumped from 40 terabytes to 80, then 160, then 320. The cloud providers hosting Axiom servers were programmed to prevent crashes by automatically scaling resources. As the ghost data rapidly expanded, consuming memory at a terrifying rate, the cloud hosts spun up new expensive server instances to handle the load. They were blindly feeding an insatiable black hole and charging Axiom by the millisecond to do it. 800 milliseconds. The latency was nearing a full second. For enterprise software, a 1-second delay is a catastrophic failure. I leaned back in my chair, the springs creaking loudly in the quiet room. I let out a long, ragged exhale that sounded like a dry sob. It was live. The cancer was in their bloodstream, multiplying faster than they could track it. Right now, on the second floor of a glass building across town, alarms were starting to blare. Engineers were dropping their coffee. Greg was likely screaming into a telephone. Simon was probably staring at a monitor, completely unable to comprehend the arcane, self-devouring mathematics of his own creation. I closed my eyes, listening to the heavy mechanical thud of the washing machines below. I was perfectly still, exhausted to my marrow, as the empire I built finally began to tear itself apart. By 6:15 p.m., my ping script stopped returning millisecond counts and simply began flashing a stark yellow request timed out. The servers hadn't crashed yet, but they were no longer communicating with the outside world. They were too busy talking to themselves, stuck in a narcissistic, recursive loop of data replication. I opened a new tab and pulled up Twitter. I searched for Axiom's company handle. For the first 20 minutes, it was just confused grumbling. A logistics manager in Seattle complaining that his freight manifests weren't syncing. A regional bank in Chicago tweeting at Axiom support, asking why their interbranch transfer dashboard was hanging on the loading screen. Then the complaints shifted in tone. Confusion curdled into panic. At Axiom support, our entire billing portal is locked. We have 400 trucks sitting idle at the depot because we can't generate the routing slips. Update, please. Is Aegis down? Our API calls are timing out. We are bleeding money here. I sat back, rubbing my eyes, until bursts of static popped in my vision. The studio apartment was freezing. The radiator hissed, spitting out a meager metallic-smelling warmth that barely reached my desk. My feet were numb inside my socks. I reached for my coffee mug, but the dark liquid at the bottom was cold and filmed over. I didn't feel like a mastermind. I felt sick. My stomach acid churned, a sour hot pressure creeping up my esophagus. This was the reality of the bomb I had built. It wasn't just Simon's career I was vaporizing. It was supply chains. It was payrolls. Real people sitting in cubicles thousands of miles away were currently tearing their hair out, staring at freezing screens, terrified. They were going to be fired for a catastrophic system failure they couldn't control. I opened my terminal and ran a tracer route to Axiom's primary cloud ingress, IP. The packets bounced through the national backbone, hit the regional data center, and then vanished into a black hole. The cloud provider Axiom used was the biggest in the world. Their infrastructure was designed to handle planet-scale traffic. When a client's application demanded more memory, the provider's automated hypervisors simply spun up new virtual machines, linking them together to share the load. It was an elastic, brilliant system designed to prevent downtime at all costs. But I had turned that brilliance into a weapon because the data index verification process was disguised as a critical, high-priority background task. The cloud hypervisors assumed the massive spike in memory usage was legitimate client activity, so they fed it. Every time the ghost data doubled, the cloud provider allocated more hardware, RAM, CPU cycles, storage blocks. Axiom was on a tiered enterprise contract. I knew the pricing structure by heart because I had designed the original Vault architecture to minimize those exact costs. Base tier was $50,000 a month. Above that, you paid by the gigabyte and the processor hour. At 7 p.m., I ran some rough math on a piece of scrap paper, the graphite of my pencil snapping against the desk. If the data was replicating exponentially every few seconds, Axiom wasn't just burning through their monthly budget. They were racking up cloud hosting fees at a rate of roughly $12,000 a minute, $700,000 an hour. By midnight, they would owe the cloud provider over $3 million in overage charges alone. By tomorrow morning, it would bankrupt them. My phone vibrated against the particle board desk. The sudden, violent buzz made me flinch so hard, my knee slammed into the underside of the table. I picked it up. The screen glowed with an unknown number. I let it ring. It stopped. Then, immediately, it started vibrating again. Same number. I declined the call and flipped the phone face down. The vibration ceased, replaced by the heavy, oppressive silence of my room, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the washing machines downstairs. 5 minutes later, an email hit my personal inbox. Sender Greg.H. at axiomsoftware.com. Subject: urgent. Nate, pick up your phone. Nate, we are experiencing a critical architectural failure with the Aegis deployment. Simon is unable to isolate the memory leak. The rollback protocols are failing. The system is rejecting the previous beta branch. We need you to come into the office immediately. We will double your previous salary and pay a $50,000 consulting fee if you can stabilize the redundancy algorithms tonight. Call me the second you read this. I stared at the glowing pixels. Simon is unable to isolate the memory leak. Of course he was. He didn't write the code. He didn't know the logic. He was a salesman wearing an engineer's clothes, and he had just stepped on a landmine in a language he didn't speak. They were begging me to save them. They were offering me money validation, everything I had killed myself for in my first life. I could walk in there, type the 5 lines of code required to kill the dormant process, and walk out a hero. I would be rich. Simon would be exposed as a fraud, but the company would survive. I grabbed my jacket. The rough canvas felt heavy in my hands. I slipped my arms into the sleeves and reached for my keys. Then I stopped. I looked at the keys, dangling from my fingers. I thought about Greg's face in the conference room. Given your performance reviews lately, I find it hard to believe you engineered an enterprise-level dynamic algorithm. I thought about the security guards grabbing my arms. I thought about the 3 years of starvation in my previous life. The way Simon had smiled on the magazine covers while my chest gave out on cold concrete. They didn't want to make things right. They just wanted to stop the bleeding. If I fixed it, Simon would spin it. He would claim it was a minor bug I had introduced before I left, and I was just cleaning up my own mess. The machine would protect itself. I dropped the keys back onto the desk. The metal clattered loudly. I unzipped my jacket and sat back down in the squeaking chair. I pulled my keyboard close and opened my email client. I didn't reply to Greg. Instead, I drafted a new email to the cloud hosting provider's automated billing department, spoofing the sender address to look like it came from an internal Axiom server monitoring tool. I requested an immediate itemized PDF export of the current day's resource utilization and unbilled overages to be sent to Axiom's board of directors. I hit send. Let them see the fire. By 10:30 p.m., the digital landscape was a war zone. Axiom's stock, which had surged at the opening bell, was getting hammered in after hours trading. Financial news bots had picked up the chatter on Twitter and Reddit. Articles were auto-publishing, with headlines like Axiom Software Experiences Catastrophic Outage on Day of Major Tech Rollout. I was eating cold, generic brand peanut butter, straight from the jar, with a plastic spoon. The heavy, sticky mass coated the roof of my mouth, tasting vaguely of stale oil. I couldn't look away from the screens. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't an unknown number. It was a contact I had blocked months ago, but the voicemail notification still pushed through. I clicked the icon. The audio began to play through the tinny speaker of my phone. Nate, Simon's voice. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't pitched for a focus group. It was ragged, breathless, and laced with a raw, primal panic. I could hear the background noise, the chaotic din of the Axiom engineering floor. People shouting. The sharp, mechanical ring of desk phones going unanswered. Nate, you need to answer your phone, you vindictive piece of shit. I know what you did. I'm looking at the core dumps. The data isn't compressing. It's looping. It's replicating itself. A pause. I heard a shaky inhale, the sound of a man trying to pull enough oxygen into a collapsing lung. I can't stop it. Simon's voice cracked. The arrogance was completely gone, hollowed out by terror. The AWS autoscaler is locked into a runaway feedback loop. We're burning $100,000 every 10 minutes. Greg is talking to legal. The board is threatening to call the SEC because I told them I understood the architecture. Another pause. The shouting in the background grew louder. Someone yelled about a hard shutdown. "I'm sorry," Simon whispered into the receiver. The words sounded like dry leaves scraping across pavement. "Okay, I'm sorry. I took it. I took the drive. I'll admit it to Greg. I'll tell them it was yours. Just tell me how to kill the replication loop. Please, Nate. They're going to put me in prison for investor fraud. Please." The voicemail ended with a sharp beep. I sat very still. The peanut butter sat heavy, like a stone, in my gut. He had broken. The golden boy was on his knees, weeping into a microphone, begging the ghost of the man he killed to save him. It was exactly what I had dreamed of for 3 years in my past life. It was the moment I had traded my soul for when I woke up in that cubicle. But I didn't feel vindicated. I just felt dirty. The air in my apartment smelled like sweat and cheap plastic. The blue light from the monitors cast long, distorted shadows against the peeling wallpaper. I felt like a butcher, standing ankle-deep in blood, holding a cleaver, wondering why the slaughterhouse didn't smell like a victory parade. Suddenly, my right monitor flickered. The ping script, which had been returning request, timed out for hours, abruptly threw a new error. Fatal connection, refused. My breath caught. I dropped the plastic spoon. It clattered against the keyboard. I quickly tabbed over to the cloud provider's public status dashboard. I watched the live traffic graph for Axiom's server cluster. The line, which had been a massive, towering peak of data throughput, suddenly plummeted. It dropped like a stone hitting the x-axis and flatlining. Zero traffic, zero processing. They had done it. Simon, in a blind panic to stop the financial hemorrhaging, had authorized a hard kill switch. He had bypassed the graceful shutdown protocols and simply severed the power to the virtual server instances. A cold, heavy dread settled into my bones. "You idiot," I whispered to the empty room. I had built the trap perfectly. I had designed the data_index_verification process to inextricably link the replicated ghost data to the master index of the real, uncorrupted client data. They were intertwined, a tangled knot of legitimate records and synthetic garbage. If you let the system run, it would consume all available memory and bankrupt you. But if you terminated the process violently, if you cut the power while the database was mid-write, frantically trying to index millions of ghost files, the master directory would shatter. It wouldn't just lose the ghost data. It would corrupt the relational architecture of everything. I opened a secure, encrypted terminal. I pinged the master database cluster. No response. I pinged the backup cluster. No response. The replication loop had already infected the backups before they pulled the plug. It was gone. All of it. Decades of historical logistics data. Millions of financial transaction ledgers. Health administration records. The core operational memory of 40 major corporations instantly turned into scrambled, unreadable static. Axiom didn't just have a temporary outage anymore. They had just permanently destroyed their clients' data. The silence in my apartment was deafening. The washing machines downstairs had finally stopped. I sat in the dim blue glow, my hands shaking violently, completely, unable to control the tremor. I pressed my palms against my eyes. They were wet. I wasn't crying for Simon. I was crying because I realized in that moment that I was no better than him. He had stolen my code to build an empire. I had allowed it just so I could burn it down with everyone trapped inside. The monster hadn't just eaten him. It had eaten me too. The collapse was total, and it was brutal. Axiom Software didn't survive the week. By Wednesday, 3 major logistics firms had filed class action lawsuits for catastrophic breach of contract and gross negligence. By Thursday, regional healthcare providers were petitioning the federal government for emergency injunctions, desperately trying to salvage whatever fragment of their patient databases hadn't been shredded into digital confetti. By Friday at 4 p.m., the board of directors fired, Greg terminated Simon for cause, and formally filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. It was a desperate, futile attempt to shield the executives from the blast radius of personal liability. It didn't work. The damage was too public, the scale of the financial devastation too vast. I watched the autopsy of the company play out through a fractured lens of LinkedIn updates and local news segments. The liquidation happened fast. The sleek, frosted glass conference tables, where Simon had lied to the board, were auctioned off for pennies on the dollar. The expensive ergonomic chairs, we had begged for the dual monitor setups, the break room espresso machines, all boxed up and hauled away in unmarked white box trucks. That was the part that kept me awake at night. It wasn't the servers melting down. It was the human debris I had created. I scrolled through my feed and saw the junior developers' kids, fresh out of college, who had idolized Simon, begging for freelance work to cover their rent. I saw the receptionist, a single mother, who always kept a bowl of mints on her desk, posting that she was looking for immediate administrative placement. I had burned the castle to kill the king, but I had locked the doors on the servants before I struck the match. The guilt was a physical thing. It tasted like ash in the back of my throat, a dry, suffocating dust that no amount of cheap whiskey or expensive coffee could wash away. But the federal government didn't care about the receptionist. They cared about the millions of dollars of evaporated venture capital. The SEC opened an investigation into Simon less than a month after the crash. When you stand in front of seasoned investors and swear on legally binding documents that you are the sole architect of a proprietary technology, and that technology subsequently self-destructs, taking 30 corporations down with it, the government takes it very personally. They subpoenaed his emails. They seized his encrypted hard drives. Simon tried to blame me, of course. He told the investigators that a disgruntled former employee had sabotaged the repository. But I had built the trap too well. When federal forensic auditors dug into the code, they didn't just find my dormant logic bomb. They found the metadata on the stolen repository. They found the microscopic timestamps showing exactly when the files were transferred from my external drive to his laptop in the dead of night. Most damning of all, they recovered the frantic deleted Slack messages he had sent to Greg during the meltdown, explicitly admitting he didn't understand the architecture and couldn't isolate the leak. He was indicted on 4 counts of wire fraud and 2 counts of securities fraud. I read the final indictment on a cold, heavily overcast Tuesday in late January. I was sitting on a wooden park bench near the harbor, a thick, scratchy wool scarf wrapped tightly around my neck. The wind coming off the gray water was bitter biting at my exposed cheeks and making my eyes water. I held a paper cup of expensive pour-over coffee. The cardboard sleeve was warm against my raw palms. It was a small, quiet luxury I could finally afford after taking a mid-level engineering job at a boring, violently stable insurance firm. I zoomed in on the photograph accompanying the article on my phone. It was Simon, walking down the granite steps of a federal courthouse, flanked by two exhausted-looking public defenders. His accounts had been frozen. He couldn't even afford the shark suit lawyers anymore. He looked 10 years older. The tailored navy blazer hung loosely on his shoulders, draping over a frame that seemed to have hollowed out from the inside. His hair, usually styled with an effortless, expensive precision, was flat and thinning, but it was his eyes that caught me. They were stripped of that practiced focus group warmth. They were wide, frantic, and entirely empty. I stared at the image, searching my chest for a spark of joy, a rush of triumph. I waited for the vindication to hit me, the cinematic high of seeing my abuser put in the ground. There was nothing, just a vast, echoing quiet. The revenge was complete. The timeline was corrected. The man who had driven me to an early grave in another life was ruined in this one. But my chest still ached. The phantom pain of the fatal heart attack remained a psychological scar that throbbed with a dull, heavy pressure whenever the weather turned cold. I locked my phone, the screen going black, and slid it into my coat pocket. I stood up my knees, stiff from the cold, and began to walk. My new office was 10 blocks away. It wasn't a startup. There were no ping-pong tables, no visionary CEOs talking about disrupting paradigms or leveraging synergy. It was gray industrial carpets, predictable hours, and legacy code that did exactly what it was supposed to do, safely and quietly. My new desk didn't smell like ozone and desperation. It smelled like lemon pledge and stale printer ink. My route took me past the old Axiom building. I stopped on the sidewalk across the street, letting the collar of my coat shield my neck from the wind. The glass facade was already dirty, streaked with dried rain, and the oily grime of city traffic. The sleek, brushed steel logo above the main doors had been unbolted. All that remained was a faint, lighter silhouette of the letters etched into the concrete, like a chalk outline at a crime scene. A large red "For Lease" sign was taped roughly to the inside of the main lobby window. The edges of the tape were already peeling. I stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the city. The smell of diesel exhaust from a passing bus filled my lungs. I looked up at the second floor. Through the unlit glass, I could barely make out the empty floor plan. I remembered the exact rough texture of the carpet in my old cubicle. I remembered the high-pitched whine of the overhead fluorescent lights. I remembered the heavy, brushed aluminum hard drive sitting on my desk, waiting in the dark to be stolen. It felt like a lifetime ago. It felt like it had happened to someone else. I took a deep breath of the freezing air. It hurt sharp and clean, expanding in my completely healthy, 30-year-old lungs. I didn't win. You don't win when you build a bomb. You don't walk away from an explosion looking like a hero. You just survive the blast radius covered in the dirt of what you destroyed. But I was alive. My heart beat steadily against my ribs, strong and uncompromised. I had kept the darkness, harbored it, and unleashed it. It had burned away the rot, leaving behind nothing but scorched earth and rusted metal. Now I just had to figure out how to plant something in the ash. I turned away from the empty building. I tightened my scarf, tucked my chin down against the biting wind, and started walking toward work. I kept my eyes on the cracked pavement ahead. I didn't look back. Revenge is never as clean as the movies make it look. It leaves ash in your mouth and collateral damage in its wake. If you felt the weight of that collapse, If you've ever had to watch your own creation burn just to take down a thief, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I want to hear from you in Nate's shoes. Would you have stopped the countdown? Or would you let the system devour itself to expose the lie? Drop a comment below with your thoughts. And share this video with someone who needs a reminder that karma has a wicked sense of timing.